Well, okay, here we are. Last time, as we're going through this study, we saw that from the perspective of humans looking towards God, we can say that Christ was crucified to save a fallen creation, and that would be correct. But in our paradigm of Christ crucified before the foundations of the world, we have the opportunity then to kind of look more from God's perspective, looking toward humans. And the creation, including humankind, was put in place and allowed to fall so Christ would be crucified. So this time we're going to begin with a look at how the creation story itself illustrated the work of the cross. And I'll answer some of the questions I posed last time. And here is our group of key verses. I kind of moved them around a little bit today, and I hope I got them in the right order. And we're not going to be looking all of these up, but we will be referring to all of them. So, in the creation narrative, we see that each step of the way, God declares what he has done to be good. But then after the creation of the man and the woman, he calls it very good. So why is this? As the creation is put in place for the sake of the crucifixion, God is building the theater for which his demonstration to the powers and principalities in the heavenlies, and this is good. He's building the stage on which his demonstration will be played out. When Adam and Eve are created, the vehicle for the incarnation is put in place, and this is very good. Now here again we can invoke Deuteronomy 32:8, where God assigns all the nations of the world to these powers and principalities, except for he reserves Israel for himself. And because Israel is a microcosm of mankind in general, and they particularly will be the vehicle for Messiah. Now, God does other works through Israel as well, not the least of which is the revelation of Scripture. But it is that role they play as the seed is passed from Abraham on down all the way to Mary, that they are the vehicle for Messiah. We see in the penultimate chapter of Leviticus, which is the next to last chapter, God is going on about how they must be obedient to his law, and he focuses in on the Sabbath for the land, the rest of the land. And if you do not do this, then I will scatter you abroad, and I will bring my judgment down upon you, which was a prophecy of the Babylonian captivity. But he says, I will not break my covenant with you. And that's because this covenant is of the seed, and he is going to bring about the Messiah through Israel. God's faithfulness towards Israel survived ruinous disobedience throughout their history, because he saw that vehicle for Messiah as being very good. Christ crucified before the foundations of the world was in place before creation, and creation was put in place to serve that end. And as such, even the creation account proclaims the gospel. And I've got 9 ways in which this is illustrated, and that is not to say that that's all the ways, but it is the ones that I have. Number 1, God created all things in 6 days. He finished his work and rested on the 7th day. Jesus hung on the cross for 6 hours. He declared his work finished and rested on the 7th hour. Number two, in the fall, the tree of life was concealed. And at the crucifixion, the tree of life was revealed. And this is the cross. Jesus is actually said a number of times to have hung on a tree. So this is the tree of life for us now, is the cross. Now, I'm going to enter into speculation here, and this is just me. So, as someone once said, I wouldn't go to the stake for it. But this is something that has occurred to me, that perhaps the tree of life that we see in the creation narrative or the garden narrative is a poetic way of expressing that there was an understanding of the cross, and that understanding was mostly generationally forgotten after the expulsion from the garden. Now, it's certainly not a desire to undercut a more literal understanding of the garden narrative, but I mean, there's just some things that lead me to think that this might be the case. For instance, the tree was planted before the fall, just as the cross was established before creation, the tree of life. There seems to be a residual memory within mankind of this idea of the God who dies. Many mythologies have this figure in it, the God who dies. We also have the idea that many in the church have believed of oracles, God speaking to the Gentiles through oracles. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel has a number of what they call pendentives around the borders of the ceiling. Pendentive is a architectural support, but it creates small little areas which Michelangelo painted as alternating prophets and sibyls that had spoken of a Messiah. So you've got many of your Jewish prophets that we know from the Bible, and then oracles from Gentile cultures around the Middle East. So there's this idea even among ancient Gentiles of the need for a Savior. Another thing that we can point to is animal sacrifice. Blood sacrifice began after the expulsion, and it is common among mankind, among ancient cultures, the idea that relationship with God depends on shed blood. And then we've got Jesus, who says flatly, "I am the life." Now, we talked some about Jesus and these intangible nouns last time. And last time we looked at how he is light. He is light. But also, one of the other things he says is he is life. So this raises some questions that we can look at in the law. And the first one is Leviticus 17, verse 10 and 11, which I will read. "If any one of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." Okay, so this is the prohibition of the eating of blood. And it actually goes back to Noah, where God puts his stamp of approval on the eating of meat, but without the blood. Now, as we've been studying, the crucifixion preceded the creation as God's reality. So it also precedes the law. So the law reflects the crucifixion in types. And this is one detail that we can look at concerning that. And as we read, the reason for not drinking blood is that the life is in the blood. Okay? So blood is essential to life, or to animal life as we know it. But it's also possible to be dead and still full of blood. In fact, I would say that's the usual state of a person or animal who has just died. It can bleed to death, but usually that's not the cause of death. So what is really being said here about the life is in the blood? Well, the drinking of blood is the exclusive right and privilege of Eucharist. It is Christ's blood that gives life. And everything else is a usurpation or a mockery of that life in the blood. And of course, this is the work of Satan, to try to undermine the truths of the faith. And it is an abomination. And we can see how tough it was in John 6, in verse 53 of John 6. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the blood of man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Now, this was an incredibly shocking thing to say to a Jewish audience. And of course, it's in this chapter where we see that a lot of his followers peeled away from him. They couldn't handle it. But this is why the prohibition against drinking animal blood. It is the exclusive right of the Eucharist. So then later on in Acts, in chapter 15, we see in verses 19 and 20, this is James ruling after the Jerusalem Council about what they should require of Gentile believers. And he says, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood." So James understands the importance still of not drinking blood. That is the singular privilege of the Eucharist. Okay, so this leads us then into something that's even more controversial: human sacrifice. Well, what does the law say about human sacrifice? This is a little bit long, but I'm going to read it anyway. Leviticus 20, verses 1 through 5. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech," one of the local pagan gods, "shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man, and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech, to make my sanctuary unclean, and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to that man, when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan, and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him in whoring after Molech." Okay, now this is about human sacrifice, sacrificing children. And the language, like it was against drinking blood, is very strong. So this is something that God treats very seriously. Human sacrifice is an abomination to God. But what was the crucifixion if not a human sacrifice? Creation actually was put in place for the sake of a human sacrifice. Now, granted, this is not anything ordinary. Okay, this is God the Son. But again, it's that exclusivity of the cross that makes all other human sacrifice a mockery and an abomination. This also justifies God in commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. We recognize it as a type, and as such, God stopped it, and that maintains it as just a type. But it was a type of the one legitimate human sacrifice. And Abraham at the time believed it to be that redemptive sacrifice and resurrection. We read this in Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. So, that's a long way to go from speculating that the tree of life may have been an understanding of the cross, but that's kind of the rabbit trail that you can take on that. And again, that was speculation on my part, so you take that into consideration. All right, number 3. Jesus hung on the cross like fruit hangs from a tree, fruit that was offered to be eaten. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." He calls himself the manna from heaven. And again in the Eucharist, he says, "Take, eat, this is my body." So in that way, he reflects again the tree of life and all the trees that produce fruit within the garden. It was for eating. Number 4, God prepared a garden for the man. Jesus was laid in a garden after he was taken down from the cross. Number 5, Adam was created from the dust of an uncorrupted world, and Jesus emerged from a place in the ground, a tomb that knew no corruption, a tomb that had never been used. 6th way, Adam rose alive out of the earth. Jesus rose alive out of the earth. Number 7, God breathed life into the man. The risen Jesus breathed the Spirit into his followers. This is from John 20:22. Now, the word that is used for breathe in that verse, the Greek word is emphyseo, and it appears only one other time in Scripture. And of course, it's Greek, so it's in the Septuagint, the Old Testament, the Greek translation. And it is at that moment when God breathes life into Adam. Emphyseo, the same word. So there is a connection there. Number 8, Adam gained a bride through a wound in his side. Jesus' side pierced, produced the baptismal flood of blood and water that created his bride, the church. And 9, the last one I've got, in the foreshadowing, the first Adam fails and loses his uncorrupted nature. In the reality, in the crucifixion, the last Adam, which is what Paul calls Christ in 1 Corinthians 15:45, the last Adam triumphs, embodying the full incorruptible perfection of the creation restored. So these are the ways that I see that the creation story was a foreshadowing of the crucifixion, or the physical fulfillment of the crucifixion. So God ended his work, and then he rested, called the Sabbath a day of rest. And this is one of the very important laws. You could consider it to be the first law because God established it for himself. And obviously in the Gospels it is one of the really contentious things. It is so important to observe the Sabbath. Since creation was based on Christ crucified before the foundation of the world, then Jesus Christ then is our seventh day rest, as declared in the creation. He is the true Sabbath. And we see this in Hebrews 9, or I'm sorry, 4, verses 9 and 10. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. So, from this point, we can then consider Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20. And this is the great hymn of Christ's preeminence and his deity. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, and that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. The term firstborn here indicates not Christ's order in the timeline of creation, for Christ was neither a created being, nor was he subject to time, but instead it indicates his preeminent position over all creation. He has all the rights and privileges of a firstborn son, as recognized by the ancient Jewish culture, rights passed from father to son, and his father is God. He agreed to putting on flesh and becoming like his creation before his creation existed. It was created for him to make peace by the blood of his cross. So that is to say, he is like his creation in every way except without sin, as stated in Hebrews 4:15. So we still get this idea in this great, like I say, hymn to his deity. So at this point, we can move on to Revelation. Revelation 4:11 says, "Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created." That's the King James Version. All things were created for his pleasure. So if the creation was put in place for God's pleasure, we can rightfully ask, what pleases God? Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. Isaiah 53:10 says, and that is also the King James Version. The creation came about for the express purpose of Christ's humiliation and suffering, to the end of bruising the head of his enemy. And it pleases him to show his wisdom to the powers and principalities in the heavenlies through the church. So, let us consider too then the chronology of Revelation 12. The most common modern interpretation of this passage, this is the passage of the woman being chased down by the dragon. She's heavy with child, and she bears a son, which is recognized as Christ. So the modern interpretation of this passage calls the woman Israel, the nation Israel. Older interpretations call her Mary, but I tend to think that she is Eve, which her name means life giver, or perhaps the figure is symbolic of all humankind, producing the Christ. The opening scene shows her heavy with child, and then the dragon rebels in heaven. It's the same scene as in Isaiah 14:12 through 17, which we accept as being before the world was created. The male child is Jesus, the seed, and his mother is in the throes of birth before the rebellion in heaven, before the foundations of the world. Then his work is established, and he is caught up to his throne with God, and a wilderness, the world, is prepared for the woman. Having failed to kill the child, the dragon then wages war against the woman's other offspring, those who hold to the testimony of Jesus, the church. This interpretation leaves many open questions, but prophecy is never a straight line. But as well, this interpretation also turns the key to understanding the sojourn and suffering of believers on earth throughout history. And this is what we are going to be looking at next time. So, I will leave you then with, first I'll turn that off, and leave you with a comic strip, because I get all of my wisdom from comic strips. And this is Peanuts, and Linus is explaining a point of fact about Romeo and Juliet to Lucy, and then he just leaves. And she says, now that I know that, what do I do? And I like this strip because it seems to me like that is always an apt question. You know, knowledge is great, but now that I know that, what do I do? So my hope is that next week or next time we can look at some things that maybe will help us as we continue our walk through the world and through this life with Christ. So thanks again for joining, and hope to see you next time. Y'all have a good night.